Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back. I hope that you had a nice weekend. It's good to see all of you. We had a really good week last week, a good half week, I guess. We really enjoyed discussing clientelism. And I think that one of the things about that unit that was so interesting was that it kind of got to those more unseemly parts of politics that we all know exist, but that we know less about, purchasing votes, manipulating peasants, swinging elections through electoral irregularities. That's interesting. That's the kind of stuff that we're sort of suspicious of and that maybe we've seen in movies. In reality, clientelism is a problem, and it's something that has determined outcomes in places like Mexico, the Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand. This week, we are dealing with another one of these, shady, sort of darker features of politics. And this is the matter of elite influence and the ability and the power of elites to shape the voting behavior of ordinary people like us, like you and I. And so we'll talk about how elites exert that political control and under what circumstances they can and under what circumstances they can't. And we'll take a look at different examples of elite capture and influence. We'll consider experiences in what we consider the advanced democracies, and we'll also consider experiences in the developing world too. And as you know, we read about Chile this week. And maybe you've noticed by now, I like the country a lot. And so we will be talking about that case later on this week, where we begin to make some comparisons between new and old democracies. But I'm very happy that you're here, very excited to discuss this with you and learn about something that frankly I'm beginning to know better myself along with you. So sit back, enjoy this, be engaged, be ready to answer some questions and maybe discuss this from moment to moment as I incorporate you along the way. Hey everybody, great to see you. So good to feel your energy and to have you back with us. If you were paying attention in 2012, I know that was a long time ago. That was like almost 10 years ago. You may have noticed that one of the big events was threats from employers to workers that workers might lose their jobs if they don't vote for Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney was the Republican candidate for president that year in the November 2012 elections. And of course, he faced Barack Obama, who was the Democratic presidential candidate. And the Koch brothers, who own Koch Industries, were among the employers who issued these stern warnings that if workers don't vote correctly, they might lose their jobs, be laid off, face bad consequences, just in general, sort of be hurt by the outcome. And this was a really big thing. There were articles about this in newspapers, there were discussions on news media, and people talked a lot about whether employers can fire you or threaten to fire you based on how you vote. And, a lot of people raised their eyebrows because this seemed very out of place in the United States, of all places. The truth is, as you'll see, if they had gone back in time about 150 years, they would have discovered similar threats from employers, and they would have found that this kind of coercion was in fact a, a matter of fact practice in American politics, American society. But 2012 was not the end of it. In fact, if you go back to just a couple months ago, in October, November 2020, you'll find similar threats. In fact, there was a Florida employer who warned employees that if they voted for Biden, they could be laid off. And much like in 2012, this employer said that it could really hurt the workers if Biden is elected and pushes through policies that might make it more difficult for the employer to do business, and therefore that the employer would have to fire them, or that they could be fired for simply voting for Biden because it might ultimately put the company in a bad position. And so these are threats. These are examples of employers threatening workers and sort of holding their employment or their benefits or their position kind of over them and sort of dangling it and making it contingent, or at least threatening to make it contingent upon voting a certain way or a certain outcome or a certain kind of behavior. Even if we doubt the ability of these employers to do this, it still sends the same message, which is that, look, you've got to vote a certain way. You've got to vote the correct way if you don't want it to come back and bite you. And so, this is an example of the kind of influence that we associate with elites, and that we sometimes suspect elites of being capable of exerting control over the behavior of others, influencing their behavior. Kevin says in the chat, wasn't Uber, Lyft, and DoorDash doing something like this for Prop 22? They were making the workers vote yes on the prop. I do remember this, Kevin. I do remember this. They were becoming more involved politically, and although I didn't read much about it, I know that Uber especially was involved in trying to influence or sort of condition the voting behavior of their workers. They were, for example, sending out a lot of messages in a lot of, if I'm remembering correctly, they were sending out flyers and information to both voters as well as their workers that talked about some of the potential drawbacks of the legislation. So this is what we're discussing today, and this is the context that I want to set up for you. When we begin to talk about employers, we have to consider the possibility that employers can threaten to withhold employment to try to control workers' behavior. They might say, well, if you want to keep your job, you need to vote a certain way. Or if you want the company to make the kinds of investments in the future that would support the expansion of the company, you need to vote a certain way. So on and so forth. But it's not just employers, it's also potentially landlords or anyone else, frankly, who might have a lot of leverage over you, or the capacity to influence your behavior or make different alternatives more or less costly for you. So an employer might threaten to withhold a job or employment to control workers. Landlords might threaten to withhold housing to control tenants. These are both examples of the kinds of leverage that elites might use. And these are economic elites. They are not political elites. Notice that this works in a similar way to clientelism, at least in the sense that there's the threat of some exclusion or the threat of some penalty for the kind of behavior in question. But whereas with clientelism, it's political parties and politicians, in the case of this political control, we're talking about economic elites like employers or landlords. And in these kinds of situations, we're discussing the potential for economic elites to control workers and moreover to control and maybe supply their votes in exchange for money, favors, or policies. And so think about this for a moment. Employers and landlords may be able to control the voting behavior of their tenants or their employers so that they can then supply those votes to politicians or parties in exchange for money, favors, or policies that would be favorable to those employers or landlords. And so, yet again, we're dealing with a kind of exchange or a transaction, if you will. It's just that in this case, we're dealing with the behavior of economic elites as opposed to the behavior of political elites. But in both types, with both clientelism and in this kind of transaction, notice that it's the elites who initiate the transaction. It's the elites who use leverage or use their position to exert influence or control over the voters' behavior. With clientelism, it's a matter of purchasing that support or that vote, but it's an asymmetric power relationship in the sense that it's unequal. It's the party or the politician coercing the behavior of the voter. In the case of employers and landlords, it's something similar. It's different though because they're threatening to withhold a job or housing if voters, that is workers or tenants, don't vote a certain way. And those employers or landlords are able to sort of leverage the votes of their workers or tenants in exchange for money, favors, or policies from those same political parties or politicians. Now, this is really, really dirty, right? This is really, really unseemly. This is the kind of thing that is transactional, but that is also coercive. It's not just transactional, it's also coercive. This is the sort of behavior that we don't necessarily think of as consistent with democracy. But Fukuyama might argue that this behavior is perfectly consistent with the development of democracy. In a moment, we'll consider how advanced democracies have maybe dealt with or addressed this issue. But before we get there, let's look at a quote that puts this in context. And this comes from Lord Stanley, who in 1841 in Great Britain said, "When any man attempted to estimate the probable result of a county election in England, it was ascertained by calculating the number of the great landed proprietors in the county and weighing the number of occupiers under them." So in other words, this quote is saying landlords have so much influence over their tenants' votes that you can determine the outcome of an election by figuring out who the biggest landlords are, because those landlords will control the most votes. And therefore, it's those landlords who will determine the outcome of the election by swaying the race through the provision of those votes. Landlords were so powerful that landlords were the single most important factors in those elections. This is the essence of this control and this influence that we're talking about. This is Great Britain in 1841. This is hundreds of years after the country began to extend the vote, the franchise, to larger and larger segments of the population. So make no mistake, even the most advanced democracies experienced this pattern of political control by economic and social elites who happen to find a number of voters under them, so to speak, be it their tenants or their their workers, their employees. Now, it may be obvious to you, but I want to pause and sit back for a moment, and I want to discuss this. Why is this problematic? What's the problem with political, excuse me, what's the problem with economic elites having control over the voting behavior of their tenants or their workers? Casey says any sort of leverage upon voters doesn't allow them to rationally make decisions. So Casey, would you say then that this leverage upon voters takes away their freedom to vote or takes away their free vote? Kyrie says it seems like clientelism to me. Yeah, it kind of is like clientelism, right? In the sense that there's that element of control or sort of leverage or coercion, if you will. Orlando says it undermines fair elections and allows for corruption. So it's certainly not fair. It's not fair, right? There's something about this that smacks as unfair and that seems, you know, unfree, right? Well, we know that one of the first things about democracy is that the elections need to be free, fair, and frequent. Even dictatorships have elections. What sets democracies apart is that people vote frequently in elections that are fair and that involve free voting. That is, voting by free people, people who are free to vote however they wish, right? Brittany says totally takes away the free will aspect of the vote. Yeah, so the single most important institution of all, voting, and the freedom of the vote is just totally decimated by this. Casey says sort of does, depending on how much the voter is influenced by the type of leverage. Yeah, so the freedom of the vote or the capacity of citizens to freely vote or to cast a vote in a way that is not coerced or determined by someone else is just completely destroyed, right? They don't have that free will. This is, you know, this is on point. This is the main issue with this, right? And it kind of is the single biggest problem we could even imagine, right? The vote is the single defining act in a democracy. Individuals, citizens vote, as do legislators. In the same way that we wouldn't consider a legislature that is beholden to the military as free, we wouldn't consider citizens who are beholden to employers or landlords free. If you cannot exercise your right to vote as you choose, then it is not your choice. You take it from David Ricardo, who said in 1824, "It is the most cruel mockery to tell a man he may vote for A or B when you know that he is so much under the influence of A or the friends of A that his voting for B would be attended with the destruction of him. It is not he who has the vote, really and substantially, but his landlord, for it is for his benefit and interest that it is exercised in the present system." Yeah, so you're not voting for yourself. It may, in a narrow sense, be in your interest, but only in the sense that the landlord has altered the costs and benefits of the alternatives and made it so that your continued access to housing depends on voting in a way that wouldn't be your preference otherwise, or that your continued access to employment depends on voting in a way that wouldn't be your preference otherwise. This is a serious problem, especially in an agrarian society where most of the workers or most of the people in society work for landowners or work for landlords or work for these large magnates who maybe hold large assets and have lots of people who work for them. It's a problem potentially, if Koch Industries employs literally hundreds of thousands or even millions of people, maybe directly or indirectly, and is also capable of potentially influencing their vote. Are those hundreds of thousands of people or those millions of people free to vote as they would otherwise vote? If Koch Industries suggests that they might lose their jobs if they vote for a certain presidential candidate, what we're describing is a relationship of political control. Control is the capacity to shape the course of events or to influence the course of events. And in this case, we're talking about the capacity of employers to shape the voting behavior of masses, large segments of the voting population. And this then is why landlords and employers have so much potential influence when we talk about their assets and their political power and their control or their ability to influence the people who work under them. So this is a painting from 1755. It's called The Polling and it's by William Hogarth. And I want you to look closely at what you see in this painting. And you'll notice a lot of different things. First and foremost, you notice what looks like voter intimidation. You see these royal looking figures, these nobles, if you will. They may be landowners or maybe they're employers or capital owners or whatever, who appear to be trying to influence the behavior of these lesser men, right? These individuals who may themselves be landowners but may own less land, or who may work for the nobles or have some relationship of dependence on these individuals. And this is depicting voter intimidation. And this was a very natural part of elections at the time in England and elsewhere. Voter intimidation was a very commonplace theme, and really it was so decisive that elections were all often determined by voter intimidation, and of course channeled through these relations of dependence that came out of the ownership structure in society, and who worked for who, and who rented land from who, in relationships of dependence that we ourselves still exist in. And so think about it for a moment. You may rent an apartment or a home or something. You very likely work for an employer. Imagine if your employer or your landlord could say to you, "Oh, keeping your job or keeping your home or your apartment, that requires you to vote a certain way, and not just a certain way, but to vote for a candidate that you wouldn't vote for otherwise, and that really may be completely against all of your best interests. But you have to vote for that candidate because I will take away your housing or your job if you don't. And I will do that because I have the power to do that." Imagine if that was the situation. And this is the circumstance that ordinary people found themselves in. Now, of course, it was sort of an arms race between landlords and between employers, right? Like Lord Stanley's quote described, it was the most powerful landlord who was able to determine the outcome of the election, because it was under that landlord that the bulk of workers fell, and it was their votes that could be coerced and sort of used to sway the outcome of the election. But no matter how you look at it, it doesn't seem very democratic, does it? Because it's coercion and it's not in any sense a free vote. And so voting behavior is also institutional. And what I mean by this is that when we talk about voting, we can distinguish between public voting and private voting. And one of the single most important institutions related to this distinction that we take for granted is the secret ballot. And this is an institution that is so widespread at this point that we don't even really discuss it anymore. We just sort of take it for granted. But the secret ballot is what stands between us and a lot of that coercion and leverage in influence and control exerted by those powerful elites and landlords. Now, the secret ballot is basically a voting method where a voter's choices in an election or a referendum are anonymous. And the secret ballot, in this sense, is really a set of institutions or a set of practices for structuring the process of voting, and in a way that prevents our vote from becoming public. That process involves, first and foremost, creating voting boxes that are of certain dimensions, that are closed, and that are cut with a slit at the top. This is not made up. These are the actual characteristics of this set of institutions we call the secret ballot. Notice that when you vote, it always works the same way. The reason is because the secret ballot works that way. The first part of the secret ballot is voting boxes of a certain dimension that are closed and cut at the top. The boxes are inspected before voting, and they're only opened when the counting begins. Okay? They're inspected before the voting starts, they're closed before the voting starts, and they're only opened once the voting ends and before counting begins. The voter marks a ballot. Usually they're standing in a special booth. The booths are themselves set up so as to be sufficiently private or anonymous. That usually means that they are a certain width apart or distance from each other, or at least separated. And then in the end, the vote is placed inside the container. The way this works is there's supposed to be no identifying information at the very end of the process where there's a sort of detachment of any identifying info. In some states in the United States, there are ways of determining who someone voted for. Indiana, and I think if I'm remembering correctly, North Carolina, don't necessarily have secret ballots, but most states do. And most countries of the world by the end of the 20th century were using secret ballots. And secret ballots, as you'll see, were set up to mitigate this problem of political influence and control exercised by economic elites and landlords. These secret ballots serve a really, really important function. Institutions we take for granted precisely because they've been around for so long that we have forgotten what it was like without them. The secret ballot is one of those. The secret ballot was adopted in Great Britain in 1872. It was first adopted in Victoria in Australia in 1856. The United States adopted it in widespread use after the 1884 election, and it was common worldwide by the late 20th century. But if you go back, you'll find images like this, or lithographs, I think that's the technical term, of voters participating in the earliest elections that used the secret ballot system, which again is characterized by this separation and this process of anonymity that's supposed to establish anonymity and protect the vote in the process of voting as a private anonymous act. Now, I'm sure that many of you can imagine that there still are ways of figuring out or maybe getting around the system to figure out how people voted. But it's difficult, and the secret ballot is a useful way of approaching this problem. in trying to limit the influence of elites. Here's a image from 1900 in New York. Voting booths are on the left. And again, you'll just notice that there's a lot of consistency in terms of the way that the process is set up. But when was the last time you thought about the way we vote? It is quite orderly. And if you voted in multiple states, for example, I voted in Nebraska, California, New York, voting is the same way everywhere. It really is. It's pretty much the same way. I think the stickers look a little bit different everywhere, but the process is supposed to be about the same because this institution of the secret ballot has been adopted and put into widespread use. Now I'm going to pause for a moment and take a look at the chat. Kevin says, would the spoil system be voter intimidation, or is there a fine line? So I think, Kevin, you're asking about like the pre-meritocratic system where the bureaucracy was loaded up with people who were supporters of the winning presidential candidate. I think, is that what you sort of mean? I think that that has a lot more to do with clientelism. I don't know if that counts as voter intimidation in the sense that it's really more of a clientelistic exchange. That's more clientelism. But remember that clientelism is similar to this sort of voter intimidation and this sort of political control, because in both cases, there's this kind of asymmetry of power in this unequal power relationship where the elite, be they political or economic, are able to sort of leverage their position to obtain or get a certain outcome or behavior out of the voter. They have that in common, but the spoil system is certainly more clientelistic. Before we continue, does anyone have any comments or questions about what we've discussed so far? Has anyone ever had an employer or a landlord try to influence your vote or your voting behavior? Looks like a lot of no's. Yeah, it's pretty illegal. I mean, Jacqueline's read stories. I've heard stories too. It definitely did happen a lot in 2012. There were videos and news reports and stories that you can find that came out back then, because that was, if you remember, the election for the re-election of President Obama, and there was a lot of concern that there would be like a takeover of the economy. It just sounds completely ridiculous to even say it, but that was apparently what they were concerned about. Oh, Angeles, yes, but it is because he's a family friend and we rent one of his houses. Okay, interesting. So some folks have heard or sort of have experienced this. Interesting. Jacqueline says, I saw videos from where some landlords were telling their tenants to vote Trump and he lost, then they would have to move out. Yeah. Yeah. Well, won't someone think of the landlords? It's just so difficult to have someone pay your mortgage for you. I can't imagine. The struggle is real. Let's watch a video that shows us the sort of context around the adoption of the Ballot Act in 1872 in Great Britain. And I know that this is kind of a history lesson, but the reason I'm setting it up for you is because I want you to remember that when we distinguish between new and old democracies, we're not suggesting that the old democracies didn't experience the same things that the new democracies still experience. We're actually suggesting the opposite. We're suggesting that many of those old democracies may have experienced the same things just earlier on, many, many years ago, at a point in their development that was earlier in the process. The United States, as well as Great Britain, had clientelistic and in voter intimidation like periods where there were a lot of exchanges and transactions, so to speak, and political influence was used in a variety of ways that we would now consider irregular. So let's take a look at this video and consider the circumstances surrounding the secret ballot, its adoption, and the kinds of voter intimidation that led up to this institution being implemented in widespread use.
Today, we take it for granted that when we go to the polling station to cast our vote, we get to do so with privacy. For most of the history of British elections, this was not the case. Votes were cast in public by a show of hands, with all the risk, and often the reality, of bribery, intimidation, and corruption this entailed. So long as the numbers of voters in constituencies had been either small, or the Whig or Tory candidates able to abuse this system for their own ends, this had not troubled many parliamentarians. However, when the Second Reform Act of 1867 extended the vote to members of the working class, some worried that these new voters would be more susceptible to bribery or intimidation, as poorer voters had been in the old Scott and Lot and Potwalloper boroughs prior to 1832. A select committee was appointed in 1869 and again in 1870 to inquire into the present modes of conducting parliamentary and municipal elections in order to provide further guarantees for their tranquility, purity, and freedom. The committee's report of 1870 acknowledged that it was notoriously difficult to establish precisely when corrupt voting practices had taken place and how common they were. But of election in boroughs, it is certain, at least, that whether intimidation is extensively practiced or not, the fear of it widely prevails amongst that class of voters liable to its influence. The secret ballot was the obvious solution, but it was not without its opponents, particularly among landlords and employers used to influencing how their tenants or employees voted. A ballot bill was first proposed in 1870 by Edward Leatham, a Liberal MP. At its first reading in the Commons on the 14th of February 1870, Conservative MP Henry Liddell responded that he had an innate and invincible hatred to all systems of secret voting. Ultimately, this bill made no significant progress and never made it to the Lords. In 1871, another attempt was made to introduce secret voting, but this was defeated by the Lords. The third attempt, in 1872, was finally successful, but not without some controversy. Leatham had suggested that there should be a legal punishment for any voter who deliberately displayed his ballot paper. This amendment would have meant not casting your vote in secret could lead to 3 months in prison. This amendment proved controversial and alienated some Liberal MPs. Henry Fawcett, for instance, stated that it was contrary to the feeling of Englishmen and to the spirit of the nation that they should treat as a heinous crime the act of a man who sought to discharge a public duty publicly. Ultimately, this amendment was not included in the final act. What was included, though, were a number of new voting offences for those attempting to interfere with elections. Opening the ballot box, supplying ballot paper, or taking ballot paper out of the polling station without due authority could result in up to 6 months imprisonment. If the guilty person was a returning officer or clerk at the polling station, they could face 2 years in prison. Finally, the Act also included guidance as to how to vote in secret. The voter, having secretly marked his vote on the paper and folded it up so as to conceal his vote, shall place it in a closed box in the presence of the officer presiding at the polling station. An Act to amend the law relating to procedure at parliamentary and municipal elections, otherwise known as the Ballot Act, received royal assent on the 18th of July, 1872.
So there you have it from the archives. It's noteworthy that the secret ballot carried very heavy penalties. Those who would abuse or break that law could go to jail for many years, especially if they were officials or working as poll workers. And there was a very specific set of processes, specific ways of folding the paper, where to put it. And so, as you can see, they put in place a lot of different protections so that they could bolster the integrity of the vote and so that they could protect the freedom to vote. Voting depends a lot on the institutional circumstances, in other words. A public vote is very different than a private vote. And I'm wondering, Orlando said, and I hope this is okay with Orlando, is mentioning that over the summer at work, some of the managers would talk a lot about the need to support Trump and would talk to workers about this. And I won't mention where this was, um, but I guess my question for all of you is, if we didn't have a secret ballot, would you worry more that your employer might penalize you for voting a certain way? Would you worry more about your landlord maybe penalizing you for voting a certain way if your vote was public and not anonymous? Casey says it is very possible and wouldn't be nice. I would worry about it. Absolutely. Yeah, totally. Especially if you work for like a corporation, or like Amazon or something, or I would definitely worry, right? And honestly, let me be honest, even with the secret ballot, it still just feels a little uncomfortable. It really does. And many of you are agreeing. Virtually everyone is like, yeah, I totally would worry. And Ernie says I would still vote regardless. As would I. Good on you, Ernie. It is scary. And it would discourage participation too, as Alondra's pointing out. Not only would it undermine the freedom of the vote, but it would discourage participation. And so that would be just as bad as hijacking the vote itself, right? And so this is a really big issue for the process of voting. And as you think about this, it becomes clearer why the secret ballot matters so much and why we sort of value it and take it for granted, frankly, because it seems like a no-brainer. But that's the thing about institutions. When you finally think about what they do, it seems like it's amazing that we could ever go without them, right? Given what function they serve. In this case, the secret ballot is really a firewall sort of between democracy and the influence of economic elites. And all societies have their elites. And so the secret ballot is going to serve an important role virtually everywhere. The article that I had you read for this week is about the case of Chile. And the case of Chile is a good example of the importance of introducing the secret ballot. I don't want to talk too much about the article, but I'd like to talk with you a little bit about who the powerful elites in Chile traditionally have been. When it comes to that country in voting, who were the powerful actors who exerted control over the vote before the introduction of the secret vote. Any ideas? Ishan, yeah, you didn't spell it right, but that's okay. Who are the Inquilos?
So I wasn't 100% clear on who they were, but based on what I understand about the article, I thought they were like the landed elite, the people who own like the lands that people lived on.
Yeah, so in Chile, the traditional elite are landowners, and all societies have landowners. But what's distinctive about Chile is that traditionally, land ownership has been hyper concentrated in the hands of a very narrow slice of society. And in fact, something like more than 3/4 of the land uh, are owned by like 2 or 3% of the population, and really even more narrowly, like a handful of families. The landed elite in Chile were very, very influential because owning that land meant that they could exert influence over huge numbers of voters. That at least was the case until the introduction of a secret ballot in 1958. And the paper that I had you read for this week talks about how the introduction of the secret ballot diluted the support for right-wing parties. Landowners, the traditional elite in Chile, threw in their lot with the right-wing political parties. When you introduced the secret ballot in Chile, you see fewer and fewer votes going to the right-wing parties, and instead you see more and more of them going to center and center-left parties. This showed that the secret ballot helped to dilute the influence of those traditional landowners. We'll talk about this in much more detail on Wednesday and Friday. We've only just begun discussing this in the question of elite influence and voter intimidation and leverage. Thanks everyone for being here. I'll see you on Wednesday when we begin to deal with the Chilean case in more detail and as we start to engage in more of an analysis. Thanks so much, and I'll see you on Wednesday.
Thank you, Professor. Have a good rest of the day.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good one.